Hello and welcome back to this tutorial. In our previous videos, we were able to create our data analytics and file handling modules. Okay, so in this video, we are going to be working with those modules and we are going to achieve that by importing them into our main.py file. So the first thing we are going to do is that we are going to the init.py at the package level of those two modules, and we are going to import them so that we'll be able to access all of them in one import. All right, so like we said, the init.py is like the base module for the entire modules in a package. All right, so now we are going to import all the classes that we created in this analytics package inside this init.py. So I'm just going to write my import statement from that is from this folder, right? And then the module grouping. So we have this grouping module here. We are going to import the classes that we created. So we are going to import grouper and measure and also plotter. Okay, then we're also going to write for the second file, which is the processing, and we are going to say from dot processing, right? Import data loader, then filter, and then cleaner. Okay, so now we have imported everything in one single file, and then we are going to write one simple command that is going to represent all the classes here. So I'm going to say underscore underscore all is equal to, and I'm going to write a list of all of these classes that we imported. So I'm going to just call grouper and separate all of them by comma. So I'm going to call measure, then I'm also going to call plotter. I'm also going to pass in the data loader and then filter. So I'm just going to pass in all of them in this list. So we are going to do that for the init.py of the second package. So I'm going to close this, and in this second package, I'm going to the init.py. So, and I'm going to write the import statement. So I'm going to say from dot. So let's check all the classes that we have here, and we have file handler, CSV handler, and JSON handler. So I'm going to say that I want to import file handling, CSV handler, and then JSON handler. Okay, so and I'm going to create another list here. So I have underscore underscore all, and I will set it to a list of all the classes. Okay, and okay, so I'm going to copy that and paste. I think I'm not spelling that very well. And the second one, I'll pass in as a list, CSV handler, and then I'll type in for JSON too. Okay, so now that we have configured our init.py file, the next thing that we are going to do is that, and we are going to move on to our init.py file, right? And we are going to implement all of the methods and classes that we have created. Okay, so here I'm going to import again OS because we are going to be needing it. So import OS in my main.py file. Then I'm going to import pandas as PD. Then also I will be accessing all the classes that I created in those other files. Okay, so I'm going to say that so the first one is analytics. So that I'm going to import. So let's check what we have in this init.py. So we have grouper, measure, plotter, data loader, filter, and cleaner. Okay, so I'm going to just list all of them: grouper, measure, filter, data loader, and cleaner. Okay, so now because you have imported everything in this init.py, that is why we're able to just write all the import statements on one line. Okay, so I think we also have plotter. Yeah, and that makes it a total of 6 classes. So we have a total of 6 classes here. Then on the second line, I'm going to also import from handler, and I'm going to import all the classes that are there. So let me go to the init.py, and I'm going to import file handling, CSV handler, and JSON handler. So I have file handling, CSV handler, and JSON handler. Okay, so now this is how to write your import statement in a way that you won't have to be importing all of them. So assuming I have in this analytics, I comment this out and I go back to the main.py file, you can see now that I'm not able to access the imports. Okay, but I'm going to uncomment this so that our files will be restored. So I'll just try to, yeah, and our files are restored. Now, the next thing that we are going to do is that we are going to create functions that will be working with these other classes, and also in those functions we can also call the functions that we implemented here, right? So I am going to define the function and I'm going to call it maybe create files. So with these functions we are going to be implementing the file handler, and they'll be creating and reading CSV and JSON files. So maybe I should just change the name. I could just say maybe file handler, something like that. So I'm going to pass in my parameter, and it's going to be like a folder. That is the folder that I want that file to be created. Okay, and that folder is going to come in as a string, and then I'll close this. So the first thing we are going to do when this method is called is to create a folder. All right, so we are going to use that os.make directory, and we are going to pass in the name of the folder. That'll be passed in as a string, right? And I am going to write another command that will enable the safe creation of this folder, so that if the folder already exists, we will not have an error that this folder already exists. So, and if the folder does not exist, this function will simply create the folder for us. So I am just going to say exist okay, and I'm going to set it to true. All right, so this is an inbuilt parameter, right? So, and the next thing we are going to do is that we are going to join the name of this folder with the name of our file, so that we now have a proper file path for the JSON file when we want to read it or when we want to load it as our data frame. All right, so I'm going to call this JSON path for the JSON file. So, and I'm going to call the os.path.join method. So I'm going to say os.path.join, right? And we now join this folder that has been created, and that will be folder, all right? And then we will now pass in the name of our file name that we are going to create later on, all right? So we are going to call that file new.json. Okay, so now we have a proper path for the files that we are going to be using. All right, so the next thing is that we are going to write the data that we are going to pass into our JSON file. Okay, so I'm going to call it data1, and I'm going to set it to a list of dictionaries. All right, so our dictionaries are going to have IDs, categories, and then values. All right, so just to create a very simple data, so I'm going to have ID, and for the first one I'll set it to 1. Then the second item is going to be category. I'll set it to A, right? So the next one I am going to set as value, and I'll set it to probably 10. So let's just take this as a basic data. So right now I'm going to hit enter so that this square bracket will be on the next line, and I'm going to copy this data and I'm going to paste it a couple of times. So I'm going to add my comma and comma here, and I'll also paste it. So I'll just change some of this. So I'll change this to 2 and this to 3. Now I could just play with this. I could call this category B and leave the other one as A, and the value here I'm going to have 20, and then I'll have 30. Okay, so this is the data that we are going to be writing into the JSON file. So right now we are going to create a class of that JSON handler, right? So let's look at what the JSON handler class does. So this JSON handler class is meant to read and write a file. Okay, so if you give it a file path, right, it will read that file. And if you also give it a file path, that you have not written, it will write that file. Okay, so it requires a file path. So here I'm going to create an object of that JSON handler. So I'm going to call it JH, and I'm going to set it to, well, a class of that JSON handler. So, and I'm going to pass in that JSON file path, right? So I hope you understand this. So this JSON handler now is requiring a file path. So now we have passed in a file path for the JSON handler to work with, to read from, or to write into. And we are now going to call the write method in for the on the JSON handler. All right, that is this object that we created. So we now say jh dot write. So, and what does this write method requires? It requires a data. So we are going to go back to that place. So this is the data we have created, and this write method here requires, well, a file path that is coming in as self, and then the data. All right, so when you open it, you now see that the self.file path, right, that is passed in here as self. So self.file path will now be used to write the file. I hope you understand this. Okay, so the next thing we are going to do is to create a CSV file, right? So, and we are going to also define the path for CSV just like we defined for JSON. So basically, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. So I'm just going to make a little changes to what I already have. All right. So here we have JSON file path. So I'll just change it to CSV path. And just like we have a folder and a file name, so here I'm going to call it new.csv, right? And I'm going to also retain a list of dictionaries. So here I might just retain this very data. So I'm going to change the class here to CSV handler, and then I'm going to pass in the CSV parts. All right. So, and the data that we are going to write into the CSV, I'm going to call it data2, and here I'm going to change to data2. Okay, and I am going to move the reading of the file to another function, right? So this function will just write the file for us. So when you call this write for the two of them, it will write the file, right? So now the next thing is that I'm going to define another function. So I'll define the second function, and I'm going to call it process data. So what this is going to do is that it is going to load the JSON file, the CSV file, and then it will now group and merge and clean the data. All right. So without further waste of your time, we are going to just create the function. So, and what is this function going to require of us? Well, it is going to require either JSON file or CSV file. So we are going to pass in the JSON file part. So remember that whatever we are defining here, it has nothing to do with what we already did here. All right, this is a different argument we are creating. It's just that in order to clarify what we are doing, we use the same naming convention. So I'm going to say we are requiring a JSON part, and it has to be a string. And also we are requiring a CSV file. So we are going to call it CSV underscore part, and it is also going to be a string. So the next thing we are going to do is that we are going to load the CSV files. All right. So we are going to be using the loader method to be getting the CSV and the JSON method. All right. So we are going to be loading it into the data frame. So now we are going to create an object of the data loader class. And here we are just going to call it loader. And we are going to set it to be an instance of the data loader class. And here we are going to pass in the JSON file. All right. So, and then we are now going to, after we load the JSON file, then we are now going to return it as data frame. All right. And then we are going to set it to, well, this loader dot loader. So that is this loader method here. And then probably we can print out what we have from it. All right. So the next thing that we are going to do is that we are going to load the CSV data, right? So, and I'm going to call this loader2, and I'm going to set it to the data loader. So you remember that this data loader can load both CSV and JSON file. It will check whether it's a CSV, then it will now use the proper data pandas method to load the data, right? So, and I'm going to pass in, well, CSV part. So that's the CSV part that we defined here. So I'm going to call it df2, and it is going to be loader2 dot loader, and I will just print the df2. So before we run this, I'm going to finish up all the processing with all the processing activities that we have. So we also have grouping and merging and plotting. All right, so I'm just going to create instances and call the methods for all of them. So moving on, I'm going to go for grouping, and I'm going to set it to an instance of the grouper class. And remember that the grouper class requires a data frame. Okay, so here I'm going to pass in a data frame, right? And the next thing that we are going to do is that I will now say that grouped is now going to be, well, grouping dot group, and so we are going to call this group and aggregate method so that it will group the data and return the aggregate, right? So I'm going to call it, I'll call this group dot and aggregate on the grouping. So I'm going to say it's going to be grouping dot, so we have group and aggregate method here, and remember that this group dot aggregate takes the by, that is what we are grouping by. So remember that we have a category that is repeated, so we are going to say that we are grouping by, and we are going to set it to category. Okay, but if we look at this place, we realize that this thing is expecting a list of strings. All right, so I'm going to place this, category into a list, and I'm going to pass in the argument of the aggregate. So it's going to be ag will now be, well, a dictionary that will comprise of the value of mean. Okay, then I'm going to print grouped. So the next processor we are going to be using is the measure, right? So I'm going to call it measure, and I'm going to set it to an instance of the class measure, and I'm going to pass in a CSV, the CSV data frame and the JSON data frame so that it can merge the two of them. All right. So I'm going to pass in data frame 1 and data frame 2. Okay, so you can see we have two data frames here. So I'm going to pass in data frame and data frame 2. Okay, because this measure function requires two data frames. So one is going to be the left data frame and the other one is going to be the right data frame. Then I'm going to create another variable and I'm going to call it merged. And then the merged is going to be set to measure dot merge. So you see this dot merge here, right? So remember that this is our own dot merge and this one is the one that is built in pandas. So we are calling the merge function, and that function in turn is going to call the panda built-in merge, right? So, and I'm going to have this on variable. So, and this on variable is requiring a list of strings, right? So we are going to pass this string in as a list, and we are going to pass in the ID because they have ID in common, right? So I'm going to pass in the how parameter and I'm going to say left. So remember that our how, where we declare the function, by default is inner, but we can change it from here. Okay, and this pd.merge, we use the current how that we passed in instead of using this one. Okay, so by the time I'm done merging, I'm going to print the merged data. So the next thing that we are going to do is to try to plot our data, right? And we are going to plot this merged data. So we are going to use try and except. So we are going to set a variable plotter to be an instance of the plotter class, and then we are going to pass in this merged data. So this merged data is what is going to be plotted for us. And this merged data that we want to plot, we want to call the plot method on it. And we are going to pass in that S is going to be the category and Y is going to be the ID. And we want to use the kind of bar, and then we pass in our title to be category. So, and then we are going to write our except block. So we are telling Python to try and do this, but if it did not work, all right, go to the except block, right? So say except exception as E. So we are just saying whatever happens that is not the outcome that we expect, report it as an error. That is the exception as E. That is going to be an error. So E is like a naming convention, right? So, and it is like a variable that you are storing the error that you have from here. So, and you are going to just print in a nicely formatted string, maybe fade to plot. And then I'm going to pass in the error that was stored in this E variable. Okay, so I believe we have implemented all of our classes. And the next thing now we are going to do is we are going to write something that will initialize all of this code. So as you can see, this is a function, and this function cannot work unless you call it. And also this other one is a function. So when you call this function, everything here happens. And when you call the other function, this file handler, every other thing there happens. So, and remember, these two functions, they are at the root of this file. And the next code we are going to write is the code that is going to run by default whenever we run this file, right? So if we run the code, it will now call these two functions by itself, and the functions will now be executed. All right. So I'm going to write an if statement. So, and I'm going to say if name is equals main. So these are called dunder variables. And for now, I'm going to write pass. So we all know that if we did not call these functions, they will not run. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to say print, and I'll open and close my parentheses. I'm going to say print name. So you will now see that the name of this file is main, not because we named it main, but because this is not. So every file, this, if you come here and write this particular command, it will also give you the name main, because you are running it directly inside where you wrote it. All right, so we are running this print statement directly inside the module where we wrote it. So I'm going to print name. Okay, so we are having an error. So let's check our import statement. Okay, I don't know what. Okay, maybe. So I'll just save these files again. I think one file is not saved. Let's check whether it's this one. Okay, and I'm going to clear the terminal. Let's check whether that was the issue. So as you can see, the only output we have here is main. So the name of this file is main, and that is because we are running it directly from where the print statement was declared, or whatever we are doing here was declared. So we are running this file directly. That is why the name is main. So we are going to say that if name is main, then we want to do something. Okay, so this particular block will only run if you are running this file directly. So I'm going to clear our terminal. So here now we are going to create a variable. So I'm going to say folder will now become, that is the folder that this first function requires. All right, so we are going to create the name of the folder here, and we are going to call the os.path.join. So we are going to now use the os method that will get the current working directory. So we are going to say os dot get current working directory. So we are going to join this current working directory with a new directory that we are going to create, right? So here we are going to create a directory, and we are going to call it data files. All right, so this directory is now going to be where modules and packages dot data file. So the data file directory is now going to be sitting here on the root of this repository or of this folder, right? Then we are now going to create JSON files and sample files and set it to the file handling function that we called, that is this one, so that the JSON file, because this file is going to return a tuple, right? So we are going to have a JSON file and a CSV file. So I'm going to say JSON underscore path and CSV underscore path, and I'm now going to set it to that for file handler, and I'm going to pass in this folder. So as you can see, the only thing that this file handler needs is a folder. So by the time we call this function, the folder will first, this function here will first of all create a folder with whatever we gave it, right? And then create JSON part and CSV part. And after that, we now call this process data and pass in these two things that will be returned from this function. So I am going to now call process data, and then I'm going to pass in JSON part and CSV part. Okay, so this will now call the process data, and remember that we are requiring JSON part and CSV part inside this process data function. So we are going to run this, and this is basically going to load and clean all of our data and also plot our data if we do not have any errors. Okay, so we have this error, and that is because we are supposed to return CSV parts and JSON part here. We didn't write the return statement. So I'm going to just write the return statement for this, and I'm going to return JSON part and CSV part. So I'm going to clear this, and then I'll run again. Okay, so we have been able to run everything except for the plotting. All right, so let's figure out why this is not plotting. Okay, so and from what we have here, from the meshed data that we are trying to print, that is our last print statement, is the meshed. Now we can see we have two categories here. All right, so the first category, because we are using same exact data that has ID, category, and value, so and they are just the same thing, right? So what we can do is that either we rename the category, or we are going to and drop one category column, or we are going to probably change the name of one data frame. All right, so I am going to do the former, and what I'm going to do is that before I start plotting this merged, I am going to rename it to something else. So I'm going to call it new merged, and I'm going to call the rename function on this merged category. So, and I'm going to say, well, that what you are going to do for me is that you are going to rename this merged. So I'm going to say dot rename, and I'm going to pass in the columns that I want to rename. So now you have category X and category Y. So I am going to say that I want to rename category Y to category. So I'm going to create a dictionary. So I'm going to say category Y. So I'll just copy this category Y here, and I'll rename it to category, so that we now, because right now we don't have a column called category. We just have category X and category Y. Then you have something like a collection of categories here. All right, so I'm going to rename it to category, and so I'm also going to rename this value Y to value. So I'm going to pass in another key value pair in this dictionary, and I'm going to say that I want to rename value Y to value. Okay, and after that I am going to drop category X and value X. So I am now going to say dot drop, and then I'm going to pass in the columns that I want to drop. So, and here again, we are going to pass a list of category X and value X so that we will not have repeated data. So in a string, we have that, and in another string, we have value X. And now we are not going to plot this merged directly. We are going to create this version of the merged data that we have already cleaned up a bit. So I'm going to call new merged, and we are going to try to run this again. So I will save this and run. Okay, so we have another error, and it says that value y not found in access. All right, so okay, so and that's because we have a trailing space here. So I'm just going to close up that space, and I'm going to run this again. So now we have everything working fine. So we have our data frame, our cleaned data, and our merged data, and then the plot. So this is how you can create, import, and use the modules that you created by yourself. And as you can see, we can see that the CSV and the data files were created, and that this data file folder was also created, right? So we can see that everything worked out perfectly fine. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope to see you in our next series.